What air-cooled 911 should I buy? I get this question so often, and the most common one I get is, do I buy a 3.2 liter Carrera? Do I buy a 964 or do I buy a 993? So real quick, I'm going to talk you through the pros and cons of each model, and maybe this will help you decide which one I should put in my garage. So a couple things. If you've watched any of my videos, you know I have a few pet peeves. So I'm just going to lay it out there. This is one of my pet peeves. I watch a lot of videos on these cars, and people make judgments based on having read another review or seen some photos or watched a YouTube video, right? Or they make an opinion because they drove a friend's car. I'm going to give you some experiences. I've been driving an air-cooled 911 for the past 30 years. I've experienced driving everything from short wheelbase, long wheelbase, mid-years, 911 SCs, 3.2s, 964s, 993s. I've used them as my daily driver. I've worked on them. I've taken them to the track. I have a lot of real-time seat experience, and I can speak to how these cars are going to feel and what things are going to be good and what things might, frankly, drive you crazy. So let's jump right in and talk about that.
Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications by clicking on the bell icon and never miss a video. We've got lots of Porsche content coming your way.
Are you protecting your drive? I certainly haven't been. I've long neglected to install a radar or dash cam in my car. Turns out I can have the best of both worlds with the Escort Radar Redline 360C, as well as an Escort M2 Smart Dashcam, which I'll be mounting on the windshield. Escort Radar's friend of PCA and sponsor of this and many other videos sent us the Redline and the M2 to test out in our own cars. So without further ado, let's unbox these and install them in my car. The Escort Redline can be used alone or paired with the M2 Smart Dashcam. The Drive Smarter app integration combines navigation and detection and gives access to settings, features, and to view footage.
Caution, red light camera ahead.
Arrows on the red line tell you where law enforcement has been detected. There's the car band. The M2 Smart Dashcam adds protection with date, time, GPS coordinates, and velocity timestamped onto the footage. Be ready for every scenario. Protect your drive. Visit escortradar.com today.
So let's start with the 3.2 liter Carrera and what's good about this car and where this might be a great fit. So a couple things about this car. This car, to me, I'm 48 years old, I'll disclose that here on the video, and this is the 911 of my generation, the impact bumper 911. When I visualize what a 911 looks like, it looks like this car, this friendly face, this upright fender, the sweep of the hood. I love everything about the aesthetics of this car. I love the Fuchs wheels. This car, to me, says Porsche. So I think the aesthetics, and of course aesthetics are highly personal, but I really like the aesthetics of these cars. I also like how simple this car is. This car does not have things like anti-lock brakes. It does not have airbags. It has a torsion bar base suspension. It's not a modern car by any stretch of the imagination, but what it is an heirloom quality car, a car built to last a person's lifetime. So if you appreciate engineering, if you appreciate build quality, you appreciate something iconic, a 3.2 Carrera could be a really good choice. The things I like about it, it's relatively simple to work on. So if you're a hobbyist and you want to jump on one of the forums and learn how to do your own service, this car, very approachable. So if you're interested in doing your own service, of these three cars, I would give a nod to a 3.2 Carrera. I would also argue because it's the simplest of the three, it's probably going to have the lowest overall maintenance costs and sort of things you're going to be facing or dealing with. And so a lot of times people will use this term bulletproof, and if you watch my videos, you know I don't like that term. because frankly, it's a 40-year-old German car, so it's not going to be bulletproof. You're going to have a relationship with the car, and if you're not going to do your own service, you're going to have a relationship with your Porsche service center. That's just as honest as I can be, but it's going to be a really enjoyable experience. So if you enjoy having a relationship with your car, you like the car to be very mechanical, we've got manual steering, we've got a very direct, visceral car to drive. Drawbacks on a 3.2 liter Carrera, probably a couple of them. In terms of power and performance, this car is frankly not going to beat a modern minivan, okay? So if you're looking for absolute performance, a 3.2 Carrera is not going to be your car. But from the seat of the pants, the smells and sounds and feels as you rev it up and you throw it through a corner is very rewarding. But absolute performance, this is not going to be your winner. The other things that you're going to give up, modern HVAC. So if you live in South Florida and you tell me, Nathan, I really, really want cold air conditioning in the summertime, this may not be my best suggestion for you. In the aftermarket, you can make some improvements, but it's never going to be like your modern Escalade. It's just not going to do it. In terms of safety, these were a very safe car in their period, but of course you do give up a lot of the modern safety equipment. So sometimes someone will say to me, ooh, I'm a little anxious to go to a car, for example, without airbags or without anti-lock brakes. That would be some of the things with the 3.2 liter Carrera. But again, to me, it's so iconic. They're so pretty. They're mechanically robust. They're fun to work on. They have a lot of support. And those are some of the highlights of maybe why you might pick a 3.2 Carrera. Let's jump over to the 964. The 964, Porsche introduced for 1989 and a half, and was the first really radical departure. Basically what Porsche did, for a couple reasons, they were kind of in tough financial position, and they knew they couldn't really mess with the basic shape of the car. And so the body shell stayed essentially the same, but think of everything underneath the car changed. 85% of the car changed. And from a driving user perspective, it was a big leap forward. So what things changed? They went to a completely revised suspension system, used a modern coilover style suspension as opposed to the torsion bars. They of course have bigger brakes with anti-lock brakes. They get power steering for the first time. Although I will say a lot of people hear power steering and they kind of cringe. Steering feel on 964s, they did an exceptional job. It still has some heft to it and the feedback is really good, so that is not a drawback in my opinion in any way. They enlarged the motor, the largest displacement for a regular 911 in the air-cooled era, 3.6 liters. They twin-plugged the motor, they raised the compression. These cars were 247 horsepower, and they went, in terms of the performance, it's a big leap forward from a 3.2. So a lot of people ask, hey, how do I get more performance out of my 3.2? I say, well, you can do a few things, but ultimately it's pretty limited. With 3.6 liter, really the big difference is torque. It's got more low-end shove on the bottom end, and it's a little easier to keep up with modern traffic. The other big change they made is they completely revised the HVAC system. So a lot of people joke that these prior cars, it was like a bad sense of German humor when they designed the air conditioning system. That's really not fair. You got to remember the climate in Germany is more akin to Seattle. And in that era when this car was designed in the 60s, air conditioning really wasn't a big priority for a sports car. By the time the 964 rolled around, they'd heard loud and clear, particularly consumers in California and Florida and places like that wanted air conditioning. So the air conditioning system in these cars is much, much better than a 3.2. However, don't fool yourself. It's still not as good as a modern car, but I would say it's maybe 80% as good as a modern car compared to maybe 30% as good as a modern car. So they're kind of a sweet spot. One of the things that I think really drives value on 964s is this gorgeous traditional upright fender that's shared with the 3.2. I guess to me, this smiling face, if you will, is the thing that greets me when I drive one of these cars, and I love sitting in the driver's seat and seeing that fender line really is evocative of the experience that I want to have. So that's the good news on 964s. The bad news on 964s, the challenges on 964s. The number one challenge is that, I blame us Porsche enthusiasts. We denigrated this car for so long that the values sunk to very, very low levels as recently as 10 years ago, and many of them suffered just from horrible neglect. And so oddly enough in the market, it's easier to find a nice, well-loved 3.2 than it is to find a nice, well-loved 964. They didn't sell particularly well when they were new, and so production was lower, and they didn't get loved. And so if you're looking for a car that I would recommend that you own, the challenge with the 964 is that's a very hard car to find, particularly if you're looking for a Carrera 2 with a manual transmission variant or something as unusual as a Targa. One thing I will say, there's a couple things you should think about too. If you're looking for a car with two pedals for whatever reason, you have to buy either a 964 or a 993 because this was the first time we had an automatic transmission. Just so you don't think I don't know this, we of course did have a Sportomatic through 1979, very rarely chosen, but a true torque converted automatic that Tiptronic introduced in 1990 in the 964 Carrera 2. If you want an all-wheel drive Porsche, of course, then you can pick a 964 or a 993. I personally would love nothing more than a 964 Carrera 4 as a winter car. My OCD doesn't allow me to drive it. I would feel too bad for the car, but I would love nothing more. Drawbacks, again, hard to find a good one. And when you do find a good one, 964s in today's market are the most valuable of the three cars. And then the other issue is, from a mechanical standpoint, I would argue they probably 3.2, lowest cost of ownership, likely highest cost of ownership in a 964. They're the most prone to leaks, although don't kid yourself, 993s are as well. So they're most prone to leaks, so you're likely going to have the highest ownership and running costs on a 964. I think worth it, fabulous car. Now we jump to the 993. The 993 was introduced here in the US for the 1995 model year and represented the end of the era for the air-cooled 911 going out of production in 1998. The first time in 911 history where Porsche played tricks with us. They actually changed the shape, and you can see what they did here with the front fender. They actually raised the hood up 40 millimeters, they dropped the front fender, and they laid it back to kind of give it a common face with the other cars in the brand at the time, the 928 and the 968. So they got a common design language. The roof and the doors stayed the same, but they radically changed the rear quarters. So one of the big changes, depends on if you're kind of a hip person or not. You know, 964s have some flair to them, very much the same flair as a 3.2. And the 993, of course, gets a wider and broader rear flare. I do recall when this car came out, thinking to myself, God himself dropped this car from the heavens. I just thought it was the most beautiful car. I just loved everything about it. And I think that thought really holds in the market today. Many people feel like the 993 is the prettiest of all the air-cooled 911s. I no longer think that sentiment because they're like my children. I love all of them. I love the mid-year cars. I love just the gentle trim on the short wheelbase cars and the no flares. I like the 911 SCs. So I find them all great. But if you like the look of the 993, it's certainly distinct, and that's something to think about. A couple big pros with a 993. Performance envelope-wise, they're the fastest and the most capable of all of them. I think they're the best fit for a consumer who is coming out of a modern Porsche. One of the things I find is that, let's say you own a 992 and you want to get to that original Porsche experience. I find people have a better experience jumping to a 993 than they do with, say, a 3.2 or something older, because it's a smaller gap to span. The 993 feels the most modern of these three cars. And so while it's a significant step in reverse, in I think a good way, it's sometimes too hard for someone to span, say, a 40 or 50 year gap when they jump back to a car like this. So these are the best driving in terms of they're the fastest, they're the quietest. They completely redid the rear suspension on the 993, so they handle, I shudder to use the word best because I kind of like how the traditional old school torsion bar 911 handles, but I will say for the average driver, these are the easiest to drive at the limit. They're the most consistent, and the rear suspension is the most isolated. So this is the nicest of the three to take on a road trip. You know, cabin noise is the quietest, ride quality is the best. And they introduced the 6-speed, arguably with gearing that's slightly too tall. For performance, I prefer the gear ratios on a 964. But on a 993, that 6th gear, when you're going to go take a long 3-day drive, is really nice. It drops the revs down. They're quieter overall. This is by far your best road trip car of the three. So if I had to mention any other drawbacks to 993s, probably one drawback in my mind, factory suspension tuning of the three cars, while the most capable, to me feels the least performance oriented. It feels the most isolated, a little bit too softly sprung for my taste. So I prefer them, for example, modified slightly, whereas I like how 3.2s handle right out of the box. 964s, a few adjustments, but I like them a little bit better the way they come. One other thing with 993s, they've always been popular since day one. They never had a period of time where they're out of favor. So of these three cars, if you're out shopping in the market, you'll generally find 993s are in the best overall condition of these three cars. One thing that helps, of course, they're upwards of 10 years newer than a 3.2 Carrera. That's 10 years less time and use and exposure to the elements. But I think because they never had a period of time where they were inexpensive and kind of got into the wrong hands, it's easier to find a good one. So again, boiling this all down, you know, what advice might I give someone who's shopping for one of these cars? Number one piece of advice, buy the car that makes your heart sing. The car that when you walk out of the garage, you smile. You walk away from the car backwards, right? When someone looks on your phone, you see hundreds of photos of your car. That's the car you should buy, the car that speaks to you. So that's number one. Don't buy the car that I tell you to buy or some other YouTuber tells you to buy. Buy the one that makes your heart sing. The other thing I'll tell you is buy the best car you can afford in your given budget. So for example, don't buy, if let's say your heart wants a 964, don't buy a crummy 964 instead of an absolute rock star 993 if it happens to come your way, because you're going to have the best experience with a car that's of the best quality. It breaks my heart when people get a poor quality car and then have a poor experience. This is why I do what I do. I want you to have a good experience with the cars. So that's one of my other rules. And then the third thing is go drive and experience multiple versions of this car, because there's no science to this, but I'm here to tell you, having driven hundreds of these cars over the years, not every one of them drives the same. And so you could drive two 964s as an example with similar mileage and levels of care, and one of them will just simply drive better than the other. And so get a lot of seat time, get to know the cars, and you'll find one of those cars just simply has your name on it. So get out, love, drive, and enjoy one of these cars. Okay, now the part you're all looking forward to. I know sometimes you'll say, well, Nathan, how would I even find one of these cars to drive? It's not as good as if you get behind the wheel yourself, but what we're gonna do now is I'm gonna jump behind the wheel of each of these cars, and I'm gonna share just some of my thoughts and experiences, what things I feel through the wheel, and hopefully this will help inform your choice. So let's get in and drive these cars. Well, let's go drive the 3.2 Carrera, Damon. What do you think?
Sounds like a plan to me. It's been a little while since I've been in one of these.
One of the things I like about 3.2s, and you know, again, this probably doesn't fit for many of the viewers, but this is a little bit like home to me, you know, driving an impact bumper car. You know, these were the first cars I spent a lot of time in, and so I like the sounds of them. They have a little bit more of a, oh gosh, what would be the, how would I best describe it? Almost more the more fan noise. They have kind of a very comfortable, I don't know, just the way they sound at idle and the way that fan sounds, it's just...
Mechanical noises, a little more added to the engine noises.
Yeah, I mean,
sounds like.
Both the 964 and 993 are a little bit quieter in the cabin, so a little less mechanical sort of symphony filters in. A couple things you notice right away when you drive one of these cars: shift lever on a 3.2, a G50, so same family of gearbox that's shared in the 964 and 993, but you've got a very traditional long travel, much like you have of Porsches since the 356 era. And so, you know, for someone looking for a more traditional experience, this is quite a change. For someone coming out of a modern car, the shift lever to them feels pretty antiquated. You know, it's got this long throw, it's got kind of a small knob on it. You're definitely, you know, working the gearbox. Other inputs heavier for sure. Steering feel, not power assisted on this car. And then, you know, like your clutch feel is probably the heaviest of the three, of a 3.2. Same with brake feel. They got a little more assist in the 964 and 993. And frankly, it feels like they did get more brake, and you can definitely feel it in those cars. So the one difference is, the one thing that strikes me with the 3.2 is in no way does this feel like a modern car, which I think of as a good thing, because if I wanted to drive a modern car, well, frankly, I would
buy one, right?
I would go drive a modern car. And so if I'm looking for a classic experience, this is a pretty high note. The other thing that's kind of amazing about this car, however, is how solid it feels. It's a very, you know, sometimes you drive classic cars, and I hate to say this, but people equate classic cars with, you know, rattles and loose and kind of wander. No, these things are still drum tight.
Yeah, I don't hear any rattles, that's for sure.
No. In fact, if you ever drive one of these things, this is another pet peeve of mine. Again, I'm calling out all these pet peeves, but I'll go drive one and it's loose and rattling, and I think to myself, this is a bad 3.2.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, Nathan, what do you expect? It's an old car. And I said, no. It is an old car, but it's one of the finely built cars of all time. And so a good one should be like this car, just like a Swiss watch.
You know, from the 911s I've driven, this is almost like the perfect balance between the earlier cars and the later cars. It gives you a little bit of the earlier, you know, long hoods and mid-years, but also it's more refined and is maybe a little closer than those cars to a 964 or 993.
Oh, absolutely. With each generation, they kind of up the level of refinement. And so in my mind, I kind of lump them into grouping. And so I think, okay, short wheelbase and long wheelbase cars, the most visceral, the least refined of all of them. And then there was a jump in refinement with the mid-year cars, and a fairly slow evolution from mid-year into SC into 3.2. If there's any change, if you were to drive, for example, a 74 to this 89 as an example, the change is pretty minor over time, but one of the things you'll notice is just every little input is just that much more refined. And so, but as an example, you know, we jump on the power band on this car, sounds good, runs up smooth, but again, by today's standards, not an incredibly fast car. But a fun car, like it sounds good.
Yeah, and there's the engine note.
Yeah.
It drowns out all the mechanical noises once you get up there a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. And so, yeah, it's a comfortable place to be. So as long as you don't have enormous expectations of incredible power, or you're someone that thinks, oh, I can tune it like you could a modern car. No, this performance envelope that's offered here has to satiate you, which it does me. The classic, you know, drive a slow car fast. Again, not a slow car. I think in period these were 0 to 60 in around 6 seconds, give or take. But again, you know, pretty much your basic family sedan does that now. So, but again, it's a rewarding car to get the rev match just right. It sounds good. And then from a handling perspective, you know, the car is more the traditional 911 in that it has a fair amount of body roll. You know, the modern 911s, you have almost no body roll. These cars, you know, they're slow in, fast out cars. You kind of, essentially, you come in, you set the speed into the corner, and then what you do is right before the apex, you kind of let the car fully tilt over and roll over, and then you hammer on them and kind of rotate the rear end around just slightly, and they propel forward, and it's rinse and repeat that philosophy. So I really like the handling dynamic, and again, its overall capability is not so high that you're doing that on a public road, you're risking your license or frankly driving too irresponsibly.
And this car has that type of handling more than the 964 or 993?
Yeah, so those cars are much more composed, both just in terms of regular ride quality, but even at the limit, they're less likely to get upset mid-corner. You know, they've got better dampening in the suspension. They're more linear in how they behave. In particular, the 993, that's a big difference.
Yeah.
But having spent so much time in these cars, I sort of anticipate how these are going to behave. In fact, if I have any gripe with the 993 is that sometimes I forget, it's got that redesigned rear suspension, and I expect it's going to misbehave, and so I sort of back out ever so slightly, waiting for that to happen, and then it doesn't, and I think, oh dang it, I missed my opportunity to drive this car with a little more verve.
Yeah. Classic air-cooled sound right there.
Yeah. Now this is a G50 car. For me personally, of the 3.2s, I get a lot of questions about, G50 versus 915. I think, again, if you're a newer entrant to classic Porsche experience, you would probably find a G50 car a little bit easier to transition to than a 915 car.
I would agree on that one.
I personally prefer a 915 car because it's more my experience. But for the average person, it takes a lot more finesse, which is what I like. Again, if I don't want to have to finesse the car, well, then I just get my modern car and it demands nothing of me.
Yeah.
So
what are the things on a test drive that you might keep in mind when you're driving these? Anything specific to a 3.2 when you're behind the wheel compared to the others?
Yeah, so a 3.2. There's a couple things that I want to feel in a 3.2. Again, I want it to feel tight. I know that's a hard thing to quantify, but if you're driving the car and it feels like the steering's loose and wanders, you feel like the car's got a lot of rattles to it. It's squeaking. It feels kind of not buttoned down. Something is wrong. A 3.2 should feel very buttoned down.
Yeah.
The other thing, the motor should run very smoothly. These are Motronic injected, so compared to, for example, we drove SCs yesterday, the motor should run smoothly all the way from idle to redline. It shouldn't have any kind of drivability wonks, that sort of thing. Transmission should be higher effort but smooth. It shouldn't bark going into any gears. It shouldn't have any gear rattle, those kinds of things. In terms of power, if you haven't driven a bunch of them, this is sort of hard to quantify. In fact, kind of funny story, I had a gentleman fly out to inspect a 3.2 that I had for sale, and he drove it, and he says, oh, I love this car. He says, but my only concern is it feels like it's down on power. And I thought, okay, I said, why do you say that? Now, mind you, he'd already told me that his current car was a 992 GT3, so I knew he's coming out of a 500 horsepower car. And so, of course, 217 horsepower is not going to feel, very rewarding in that regard.
Yeah.
And but what he told me, I had to chuckle. He said, well, when I was a kid, my dad had one, and it felt like the fastest car I'd ever been in. And I said, well, when you were 10, back in 1985, it probably was the fastest car you'd ever been in. But, of course, by today's standards, that's not true. And so, more than anything, the sensation on power on these cars should be strong and linear, but it shouldn't be, you're not going to get some sense that it's throwing you back in your seat or something like that.
Yeah.
But again, you have to drive enough of them to kind of get a sense of this is how they should feel. Take the time to drive a few cars. Please don't be that person that the first one you ever drive is the one you buy off Bring a Trailer sight unseen and you've never driven another one.
Yeah.
Maybe you get lucky. That's possible. Because I meet some people too, and I'll drive their car, and they've had it for a couple of years, and I will say, hey, just this one's got some needs, and they say, well, what do you mean? And I have to explain. And sometimes if I'm feeling generous, I'll say, well, let's go drive another representative example so they can understand for themselves. Sometimes that's useful, because oftentimes they just maybe haven't driven another car. So again, just don't rush this. I know sometimes it feels like the one you're looking at is the only one on the market, but there are other cars, I promise you that.
Cool, great.
Okay, I'm excited. Now we can jump in a 964 and we can see what 85% change actually feels like from behind the wheel. Okay, so we've just finished up our drive on the 3.2 Carrera. We've jumped into this 1992 964 Targa. Started up, we pulled it out, and the first things that strike me is you'll notice, one, it's quieter. Even just at idle, it's a quieter car than a 3.2, and the engine note is just a little bit deeper, and it's got more of a sort of a bass sort of undertone and less fan noise. So it's a sort of a different soundtrack, definitely flat six, but different.
Yeah. Less treble, more bass, right?
Yep. Clutch feel is a little bit lighter on these cars. Brakes feel just a little bit firmer. And the big difference you'll notice is the shift action. You got much shorter lever, and it feels much more precise, has a lot more sort of weight to it. I do like, even though this gets panned a lot, the big airbag steering wheel, the rim itself is much chunkier. So I do like that. So let's take off and let's go see what we think.
You know, now since we mentioned the transmission, and the last one was a G50.
Yes.
I forget, is a 915 hydraulically operated like the G50, or is that a cable operated clutch?
Cable operated clutch in a 915.
And so this is still a G50.
Yes.
Okay.
Essentially the same gearbox. Linkage and all that stuff has been changed. But so a couple things that right away I notice about this car. One, I'm adjusting the temperature, and here we have the heat going. All air-cooled 911s are great. You generate heat immediately, but the HVAC system in this car, right away, it's noticeable how much better it works.
Yeah.
This one, we can get heat out of the vents. I know we talked about that the other day on the SC. You don't get heat out of the center vents. So much more modern feeling in that regard. So the first thing you notice on a 3.6, again, the noise is different, but the amount of grunt is noticeably stronger than a 3.2. Whereas, for example, when you make the jump from a 964 to a 993, it's not a huge jump from a power perspective, but really the 3.2, it's very sensitive to rev. You really want to keep revs above 3,000 RPM to really get much happening. Whereas, we're pulling right off idle on a 964, and it pulls good. And again, you have more intake roar in a 964, less fan noise, but more intake roar.
Yeah. You said you like the Carrera 3.2 noise a lot. I kind of prefer this one a little more.
This is probably a childhood thing, but I remember, there were air-cooled 911s in my neighborhood, and when I was a kid, my dad's daily driver was a 944, and I remember being able to distinctly pick out, you'll laugh, but the guy across the street had a 912. On the other side of the street, there was a 3.2 Carrera, and my dad would usually drive his 944, and I could tell who was coming home from work, and it's a silly childhood memory, but they all have a very different sort of noise. But funny enough, I worked at the Porsche dealer when 964s were new, and so there's two things that sound unique to me, or unique visceral experiences with the 964 in particular. Number one, they have a different sound of the starter than a 3.2, and I like the sound of the starter on a 964. And then the other thing I like, and this isn't a sound, it's a smell. The smell of the 964. The 964 smells the best.
Yeah, now that you mention it, it definitely has that 90s Porsche smell.
It was the right mix of the glue or whatever they were using at the time, the glue and leather, and they tend to smell a little bit less mechanical stuff, a little less oil and fuel, and a little more German leather and plastic, I guess. I think it's wonderful. But you'll notice, like at the same given speed, this is a much more refined ride. When you hit an impact, but it's also quieter.
Yeah, definitely. And the last car, the 3.2, it had the traditional 911 torsion bar suspension, but this has something different, doesn't it?
So it's got a more modern coilover style suspension, and so two things. One, from a daily driving perspective, has much better sort of impact. Like when you hit, I'd like to say in the US we have great roads, but that simply wouldn't be true. So it does a better job of sort of absorbing impact on secondary or crummy roads. But also from a handling perspective, they're flatter in the corners, and they're get less upset if you're on kind of a road that's not racetrack smooth. So
this is sort of the beginning of Porsche removing some of the oversteer tendencies of the earlier cars.
Yeah, I mean, each generation of the air-cooled cars got better in that regard. Okay, but like, see how there's way more intake noise?
I love that.
And again,
I love that.
considerably more velocity in this car. I mean, the performance envelope was a pretty big change compared to a 3.2. So I have a real strong affinity for 964s. You know, one, because again, I was around them when they were new, but I think they're, again, I like this view out the windshield. I see the traditional upright 911 fender. Of course, have the very traditional 911 dash.
Yeah.
But yet I get sort of that better low-end grunt, a little bit better livability in terms of noise, HVAC, ride quality. So it's a pretty easy car to live with. Whereas I don't have any problem dealing with an old 911 as an everyday car because I'm so used to them. But for someone who hasn't, it's a pretty big leap, and this is a marked change.
Yeah.
More confidence inspiring on the brakes too. Particularly, I'm not doing real aggressive braking here, but you can definitely tell, you know, it's one generation improved on braking. And of course you pick up anti-lock brakes, which for a large generation of drivers, they've never grown up with a car that didn't have ABS brakes. You know, ABS brakes became pretty standard in most cars by the mid-90s. And so a lot of people have not grown up with a car and known what threshold braking really is like and what to do in an event of a lockup. Now, one advantage of an air-cooled 911 has always been, since it's rear heavy, they've always braked well, because in a traditional front-engine car, of course, the rear becomes really light under heavy braking. In a 911, you almost get 50% braking front and rear, which is one of the reasons they stop so well. But then you couple that with, you know, ABS, and it's a pretty good combination.
How is the power steering compared to the 3.2?
Well, 3.2 has no power steering, but what's nice is that Porsche did a really good job. In fact, I've had people challenge me and say, oh, it doesn't feel like it's got power steering. The only time you really notice the power steering is like in a parking lot. It doesn't have the same weight of a 3.2, but they did it. Again, I sound like a Porsche fanboy. I will tell you when things I don't think they did a great job, but I think steering feel, you know, there was a lot of noise. You know, people were concerned that when they added power steering to these cars that they would ruin it. In fact, in my own collection, one of my favorite cars, I have an RS America, and the RS America is the only US one that got a manual steering rack, and it sounds heretical, but most of the time I prefer the power assisted steering in my other cars over the RSA.
I think the same thing, actually. That first 964 I'd ever been in, and the first 964 I drove, actually, was my uncle's RS America. And later on, actually, and we have a 1 mile review of me driving another coworker's 964 Carrera 2, and I actually did prefer the lightness of the power steering over the kind of heavy, and it's kind of not slow, it's just tough to manhandle if you ever get in a situation like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Porsche would have done the mistake that a lot of manufacturers make, which is they make it over-assisted and not having a lot of texture and feedback, then I would agree that the manual rack would be an advantage. But they did a good job on this car, and so really, like with my RSA, I feel like I just pay the price in a parking lot. I mean, it's not insurmountable, but it's notable, and really below about 40 miles an hour. It's, I would say, a touch too heavy. They are very sensitive to alignment settings too. 3.2 is even more so. A bad alignment on a 3.2 will really increase steering heft, and not in a good way. So with the, I guess, a non-power steering car like the 3.2, I guess, you know, tire size, as I think we talked about, is very important to that, but with this car, maybe not as much. Yeah, I mean, although I will say on almost any air-cooled 911, most people make the mistake of assuming that more tire is going to make it handle better. And they're almost never traction limited at the front. And so really what you do when you go to a bigger front wheel and tire setup is that you just add more unsprung weight, and you reduce sort of the texture and feel in the front end. And so, and I've been that person. You know, I used to think, oh, for example, on the Torsion bar cars, I'd try to shove a 7 up front and put a 225 on it, and I found that just polluted steering feel. And so now I like a 6 with a 205. And then even on these 964s, they actually drive best on the 17-inch with a 205 in the front. That keeps the steering feel as Porsche designed it. Whereas, as much as I hate to say it because they look so good, but 964s don't drive better on 18s. They do not. A little bit too much unsprung weight, a little bit too much heft to the steering at the front, and they just don't talk as well at the limit, and so.
That's a secret tip there, is try and go for the 17s if you want that
I mean,
feeling.
and I'll admit, like I have a set of speed lines on one of my 964s because it looks so good, but I do know from an absolute performance standpoint, I'm probably making the wrong call there, which is a little bit of a bummer to say. But with that, now we have experienced the 964. Let's go drive the final iteration of the air-cooled 911 and drive the 993.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so we've just wrapped up driving the 964, a car near and dear to my heart. Now we're jumping in the 993. I have a lot of seat time in 993s. I had a daily driver in 993 for many years, put a lot of miles on that car. So this is a car I'm very familiar and very comfortable with. So let's jump in. A couple things. First off, one of the things that's very notable about a 993, again, still uses the G50 gearbox, but they revised quite a few things internally on the transmission and just shift effort. It's the lowest. And if we think of, I know it sounds heretical, but as a Honda, like an S2000 is just a pinnacle of shift feel or just a light shift. 993 is pretty light effort. It's really the only air-cooled 911 I would say has light shift effort. It's quite nice. Clutch is definitely the lightest as well. Feels much more like a modern car certainly than a 3.2. It sort of splits the difference between this and the 964. The other thing that's interesting about 993s is that they, again, if we know a 964 has a different sort of noise than a 964 or than a 3.2, the 993 has something else entirely different too. The exhaust system on these cars were totally revised for the 993. In fact, the vast majority of all the power difference between a 964 and a 993, particularly just in the 95 model year, comes exclusively from the redesigned exhaust. In the 96 and later cars, it also has to do with the variable intake, the VarioRAM system as they call it.
That was an early version of one of those systems, wasn't it?
Fairly early, although the very first one was in the 968 starting in 1992.
Yeah.
Car you and I are both fans of.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so one of the things with the VarioRAM cars, this car we're driving in 97, is it dropped the torque peak around 1,000 RPM, over the 95 993, and very similar to the torque peak on the 964. So, again, one of the things we noted on the 964 was just how much stronger on the bottom end it felt. 993 is very similar, although some of that is lost just simply in the fact that they changed the gearing on these cars. And if anything I don't like about 993s, particularly the US models, the gear ratios in the car, I think frankly they were probably shooting for a fuel economy target or maybe a noise target, I'm not quite sure. But particularly second and third gear are a little taller than I'd like it to be. But again, shift feel on a 993 is really, really good.
Yeah.
Again, it's a really easy transition for somebody to make, from modern Porsche into a 993. It's not going to feel different at all, really. The only thing that probably might throw them, which is one of my favorite things about all air-cooled 911s, of course, is that the pedals pivot on the bottom. Of course, all other cars pivot on the top, and so you almost feel like you're stepping on the pedals.
Yeah.
I love it, like
Yeah.
an old Volkswagen. However, that is one piece of feedback people gave me. They said, gosh, these feel weird.
Yeah. And that's the floor hinge pedals?
Yep.
Yeah. When you first get into them, I agree. When you first drive them, like the first 2-3 times, maybe it's a little weird, but you really it's muscle memory comes into play pretty quickly.
It does. I think it's one of the things that's charming about them, quite frankly.
Yeah, agreed.
But again, ride quality, very similar to a 964. You really don't pick up on the rear suspension improvements, I think, except for in two circumstances. You'll notice it more at high speeds, like on interstate, particularly with kind of crummy pavement. You're driving on the I-5 and it's concrete. Transmits a lot less of that kind of irritating sort of cabin vibration or boom through the rear because it's got the rubber isolation there. So you'll notice it there. And then the other thing you'll notice is at the absolute limit, when the car breaks loose, it's the most linear of all the air-cooled 911s.
Yeah.
Which to me I actually kind of don't like a little bit. I don't trust it as much. I kind of I kind of have learned know how to throw the tail around on one of the earlier cars. The 993, again, sometimes I expect it to behave a certain way, and I maybe don't push it as hard as I could.
Yeah.
So really, I'm just ratting out that I'm not a very good driver. I think that's what it might be.
Yeah. So if you were to compare the 993 to a newer Porsche in the way it handles, does it handle closer to a 996 in that respect, or does it handle still closer to maybe a 964?
Still closer to a 964. There's a pretty marked change when you jump into the 996, and I know, of course, that's a controversial topic. Real quick, we got to hear again, more similar in sounds to the 964, but even more grunt.
Yeah, definitely more grunt.
And again, much more controlled when you hit an impact versus a 3.2.
Oh, yeah.
And so again, a pretty easy car to live with, and so there's sort of great beauty in that. So,
you know what I think about? You mentioned earlier about this car transmits the least amount of road noise due to just suspension improvements. I'm kind of thinking that's probably, for me at least, is the main reason why this feels so much closer to a newer water-cooled 911 than any of the other earlier air-cooleds do.
It does, and in fact, it's oddly enough, again, this is why in my video we talk about, understand your use case and what you want out of a car. So I find for myself, I drive my 993 the least of all my air-cooled cars, and it's not because it's not a wonderful car. It's that it's, frankly, I call it 5 degrees right of center. It's almost too good in my mind for the classic experience. And I also have a 996 in my collection, which I really love. I know that's controversial, but the 996 is a great car. And so sometimes if I want that more modern feel, I jump over this car to the 996. And if I want the more classic feel, then I tend to go a little bit farther back. With that said, the aesthetics of the 993 is so good. I love it being in my garage. I like looking at it. And again, if I want to take an air-cooled car, for example, on a longer drive, that oftentimes will be my selection criteria, because it is a much more comfortable place to spend a good portion of a day, particularly if I'm doing some interstate work. I know we like to think we only spend our lives on beautiful 2-lane roads. That's simply not true. And so, you're in California and we're going to an event and the traffic's flowing 85 miles an hour. The super tall 6 gear is super nice. I think, 80 miles an hour is about 3,000 RPM. It's fairly relaxing. Air conditioning works good. And so it's, if I could only have one air-cooled car and it had to do everything, I think the 993 would be my choice. In light of being able to have multiple choices, it becomes a little bit more conflicted. Although certainly not enough that I'm selling my 993 anytime soon. That's for darn sure.
Sounds like it would be a big consideration between maybe these cars for some people is, are you a 1 or 2 car household, or do you have maybe a small collection?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's all about your use case. And so, again, if you're, I think a more typical buyer profile is they've got a more modern Porsche, they want a more classic experience, they have limited experience with classic cars, and so they want one car to kind of do a lot of that classic car duty. Then I think a 993 makes a lot of sense. I think the 964 is very similar in that it offers a very similar package. I think that's a better draw for someone who wants that aesthetic or the traditional look, and maybe just a little bit, maybe 10% more edge to it than a 993. Whereas a 3.2, I think is really great for someone who's got a little bit more classic car experience, someone who wants to do a little bit more of their own wrenching on the car, or someone who truly, as analog as possible. Although in some ways I might suggest to go even older if they want to go really, really analog, but it's a pretty good sweet spot. Ultimately, you can't go wrong with any of these cars. We're kind of splitting hairs a little bit.
That's what we like to do, don't we?
But again, I just feel blessed to have the opportunity to drive all of these cars because they're all wonderful. And again, getting back to another pet peeve, most people will go on a tirade at events or whatever. They'll say, oh, the best 911 is this one. And it's usually the one that they own. And that's great. You want to be passionate about what you have. But, there's 2 things I always tell people. One, they come in all sorts of flavors, and all flavors are good. You know, I don't eat the same dinner every single night.
Yeah.
And then the other piece of it is that it's not a mutually exclusive thing. So if a 993 is a wonderful car, that doesn't mean another model isn't wonderful. They all can have their strengths, their pros and cons. And so, for example, for me, a lot of people say, well, if you could only have one air-cooled 911, what would it be? Well, my true core love, 1970, 1971 mechanically injected car, so an E or an S.
Yeah.
I just think that car is peak 911 for my use case and experience. It likely wouldn't be for the vast majority of people I talk to.
Yeah.
So, but again, a 993, if you're only going to have one classic 911, it's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall impression is 993 it's the final development of the air-cooled 911, and Porsche was on the right track through the whole lifespan of this car. And so, pretty amazing car. And again, you're just blessed if you get the opportunity to drive any of these three cars. So pick which one speaks to you and then go out and drive it.